Good afternoon, everybody. We might get started this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along to GOMA today. My name's Charlotte Quinn. I work in the Public Programs Department here at the Gallery. I'll just, before I introduce to you our very special panel of guests today, I'll briefly explain a little bit about the program Turning Art into Fashion that we've all come along to hear about this afternoon. The concept of this discussion stemmed from the exhibition which is currently on display, Yayoi Kusama, Look Now, See Forever. And if you haven't seen it already, I urge you to have a look. It closes on Sunday the 11th of March, so not much time left. Kusama, as you'll probably learn today, as an artist herself dabbled in some fashion design, but more topically and recently it has been announced that Kusama is collaborating with Marc Jacobs, the designer for Louis Vuitton. So this started a conversation about collaborations and relationships between artists and fashion designers, and I guess the topic of turning art into fashion, which we'll hear about today. So to briefly introduce our panel of guests, on the very left we have, on your very right, we have Alison Kubler, who is a local art curator, the director of MCK Art Consulting, and a writer as well. We have Byrne, who is the postgraduate secretary at the Queensland College of Art and also a fashion historian in his own right. Professor Suzi Vaughan, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Learning and Teaching at the Queensland University of Technology, and prior to that was the head of the fashion industry in the creative industry, at QUT. And on our very left, Dr Mark Pennings, who'll be chairing the discussion today. And Mark is also from QUT and he's the Senior Lecturer in Visual Arts there. So without further ado, welcome to those also viewing via the live webcast today. And I'll just quickly ask you to switch your mobile phones to silent before we start. So please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Well, hi, welcome. Thank you so much for turning up, and also welcome to Suzi, Ben and Alison. I thought I'd start off by saying that I'm wearing Cutler and Gross spectacles and a Dries Van Noten shirt, and apart from demonstrating my vanity, I think perhaps it's not a bad place to start, because is fashion just a matter of, which I do all the time, me running around showing off my latest designer gear, or is, it's obviously much more complex issue than that, particularly in relation to its relationship with art. And I know that the three guests we have today are going to give us those sorts of larger and I think more sophisticated dimensions to those kinds of issues. So I thought what I'd do to open it up is just ask a very general question, I suppose, that hopefully warms us all up, about the way in which art and fashion is similar and the ways in which they might be significantly different or subtly or otherwise. Anyone want to have a crack at that first?
Well, I mean, maybe it's the first thing that I would say about that is because I think in a way what you're asking is whether art can be fashion and fashion can be art. And I think that probably the latter question is the thing that is coming up all the time at the moment. But maybe the answer is that not all fashion is fashion and not all art is art. And I think about that a lot when, you just in general, one's daily interactions with fashion on just a very, simple level, and also one's daily interactions with art. It's quite clear that the two can be incredibly different. You can have art over here and art over here, and never the twain shall meet. So I think that increasingly you're seeing this, it's more of a grey area, if you like, and I think artists and fashion designers, it's a much more hybrid world that we live in, probably, in terms of creativity, and that's why there's probably even this question is being asked. I don't know what you think. But.
Yeah, well, sorry that you said, I'm interested for more of the distinction. You said not all fashion is fashion, not all art is art. Can someone maybe flesh that out a bit? Because I think you're right, it's a very complex set of grey areas. Sorry, Suzi.
I think it is an interesting one, and I think maybe fashion and art are two things where it's most likely that you would say that. We were thinking before, I mean, to me, fashion and art have had similar trajectories. They were both very elite. You could only afford to engage with fashion, you could only afford to own art if you were very wealthy and privileged, and that's changed. And I think that fashion and art now are things that people, you only have to walk outside this room and look at how many people are outside, from children right through, are interested and engage in, but also increasingly create. And I think that makes it very difficult. Fashion, clothing tends to be referred constantly to as fashion, wherever it comes on that continuum. and I think possibly that's more the case with fashion than it is the case with art.
I think probably the grey area that you were talking about is probably one of the reasons why there are so many collaborations between artists and designers these days, and maybe also the increasing prevalence of blogging and street style fashion and those sorts of things, which is very easy for everybody to access. Yeah.
So there's a sort of greater range, a greater variety of fashion things in which people can participate.
And people are perhaps more savvy, like as Suzi was saying, there's that interesting thing where art particularly is perceived as being an elitist pursuit perhaps, and yet I think it's sort of an ironic position in a way, because if you look at the artists, and I'm sure we'll come to this later, but someone like Richard Prince, for example, collaborating with Louis Vuitton, he comes out of this incredibly kind of avant-garde, almost punk position, and it's so wonderfully ironic and clever that he ends up collaborating with a major luxury fashion house in probably one of the most successful collaborations ever. And how interesting that is, really, because he's coming from this anti-establishment position and then ironically ends up arguably in the position of establishment, but then brings something to that house. There's a tension there all the time. It's like, has he sold out or not really? Then it works actually, because I think on any other level, and this is jumping ahead, but again, contemporary art comes with this sort of built-in criticism all the time. Like, this institution is open to criticism all the time. An exhibition is reviewed, it's artworks are critiqued, etc., etc. And yet, in the realm of fashion and art collaborations, you don't see that as much. You don't see people attacking Richard Prince for putting a joke on a Louis Vuitton handbag. There's sort of an irony there, and so it's left untouched.
I guess fashion is being brought more and more into the sphere of the museum as well in the last few years. You have so many fashion shows, like the Valentina that was recently here, the Hats show, coming more and more into that the museum sphere that they would never necessarily have been brought into 10 years ago perhaps.
So it suggests like a greater mobility between I suppose forms of cultural production, for want of a better term, that, as you were saying, Alison, about Richard Prince might be, say 100 years ago or 80 years ago, Richard Prince would have been anti-establishment when he started, anti-establishment mid-career, he would have adhered and stuck to that kind of, that kind of position. But now you can be anti-establishment today and maybe not so tomorrow, and that's much more. It's much more acceptable too, isn't it, to adopt that sort of position?
Yeah.
And I suppose is it fair to say that kind of attitude may have been driven far more by fashion, or what's happening in fashion, than what in fact may have emanated from art, from the art scene.
Well, I was thinking a lot as you were speaking that about Vivienne Westwood. I mean, if you think of that as a fashion example, someone who really went to within the establishment to be able to do what she's been able to do. And yet she's still incredibly active. You look at this artist. I mean, she's just still as current, still as provocative, but really steeped in heritage. And it's an interesting. She's not. You can't define her simply either. It's just. It's more complex than that.
It's like you get a shift from character to function. What you do is much more important than I suppose any sort of essential thing that you're claiming about yourself almost. And so, again, to reduce it back to, after just demonstrating to me how it is rather complex, I want to return back to the idea of how is art turned to fashion, or how is fashion turned into art? I mean, I agree entirely with what you all say, and it's clear that those old, I suppose, pillars of determination or description are much more fluid than they ever were before. But they're still residual, aren't they? I mean, for me to say, when does art, sort of be considered fashion, or when fashion becomes art? But I'll repeat that question again because I'll probably confuse it. But how is art turned into fashion? How is art turned into fashion, and how is fashion turned into art? At what moments it might be examples you can think of?
Well, I mean, just on that contemporary art point, I think it is fair to say that within contemporary art, you'd see definite trends you see, I mean, you would know this yourself, Mark, that there are trends that come through contemporary art practice, which is why we have isms like modernism, but also, you know, new media. What is that? And lots of things like that, which arguably are a fashion trend almost. You know, photography was incredibly big there for a time, even though it's been around for a long time, but it had like this moment of being very fashionable and collectible. So I think just on the face of that alone, fashion and art actually have an enormous amount in common in that regard, that there is something that people tap into, whether it's a zeitgeist or something that is there. And yet I think one of the things that people say is different about fashion and art perhaps is this idea that art is ostensibly enduring and made for longevity, whereas fashion, arguably, is cyclical and transient or temporary. And, you know, that's a very big thing to talk about, obviously, but that's probably where a lot of those tensions come, where people argue about fashion being in an art museum and vice versa, I guess, about how it actually works. So that idea of a fashion house collaborating with an artist, is it about bringing some longevity to the product that is essentially one season, or is it something else as well? Is it about a kind of cultural capital translating to a corporate capital?
And it's interesting what you say, because I just envisage that, you know, with, say, fashion, there's certain cycles of trends and interests that occur. Art, there's certain cycles and trends, they move in their own times, but sometimes they move in sync with each other in some ways. And as you said, that idea of the artist and the designer working together are probably very good examples of that synchronicity.
I think the idea of the art being turned into fashion is an old one, really. It's been around for quite a long time, from you know, Paul Poiret through the Russian constructivists, the futurists, right up to the present day. So it's something that artists have that designers have looked at for a long time for inspiration to bring things into their collections.
Yeah, because they share a lot of cultural cachet, don't they?
Yes,
in many ways.
And a lot of the big designers have also, Paul Poiret, Yves Saint Laurent, they've been big collectors in their own rights, as is Marc Jacobs, you know, big collector of contemporary art.
So then I'm thinking of things, Ben, perhaps like words like distinction or discrimination, or I suppose a level of cultural sophistication is something that art and fashion, you know, well, I'd say high fashion, for want of a better term, have shared. You know what I mean? They've shared those kinds of sensibilities, as you say, for quite some time.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that they've shared in that sense is that fashion, I would suggest more than any other design form, tends to start from largely highly conceptual starting points. So it's not surprising that there is that crossover and coming together regularly, because you know, if you're going to design a toothbrush, you obviously, it's largely around function. Fashion, we know, I mean, we don't need to replace our clothes as frequently as we do. The function is obviously a part of fashion, but it's a very small part of fashion. So that those conceptual starting points and those shared interests, whether they are art or previous art or other forms or those things that are happening socially, tend to bring those two forms together, I think, more than certainly any other design form.
Yeah, I suppose it's, sorry, Alison.
No, I was just going to say that the thing that keeps coming into my mind is this idea of desire. And I think with fashion, obviously, it's driven by that kind of, and I'm talking about, you know, fashion. It's driven by a kind of desire. But I think also contemporary art is too. You know, it's certainly in the time that I've been working in art and looking at art and studying it, it's so much about this cult of personality and the collectability of an artist and the hype of the new. And you know, people would argue, and I think there's something in this in a way, that Takashi Murakami would not be where he is without Louis Vuitton. And I think that's actually kind of a fair thing to say, even though this esteemed establishment collected his work very, very early on. I don't think he would have had that kind of success. And that's such a fascinating thing to think about, really, that the fashion house, which at the time was very highly regarded, but still not necessarily an everyday word that, you know, Joe Bloggs would know. No, not everyone would know Louis Vuitton potentially, but They certainly do now, I think. I think a lot of people are aware of it. And the way that worked for Takashi Murakami was incredible. Like, he really is a superstar now. And this is going off topic a little bit, but I think someone like Marc Jacobs is incredibly clever in the way he looked at, particularly, well, when you look at what they've done, Louis Vuitton is phenomenal. They've worked with so many artists, but the big ones like Murakami and certainly Kusama and Richard Prince is just fascinating. You know, it's such a well-honed eye, I guess, for something that will work. And it does, I think, tap into that desire for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and how we stay ahead of that. And it's just ironic that we end up with this crazy 80-year-old Japanese lady who's ironically the next thing. And isn't that funny? Because she's been around for a long time, but it's like this select few people have known about her, and suddenly, arguably, as he says in his little promotional film on Louis Vuitton, a lot of people will know about her. So he talks about how the store, he wants it to function like an art gallery. And isn't that an interesting idea? That's very Warholian kind of concept of supermarket. You know, the art gallery being like a supermarket. And I think that's so interesting. And I think it shows that Marc Jacobs knows what he's talking about. Like, it's not just a dumb coincidence or something, that he's really very much thinking about how it works.
Yes, and of course with Murakami, I mean, Louis Vuitton, they go nuts about Louis Vuitton in Japan.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, as you say, I mean, Murakami is someone who actually, you know, has espoused the opinion that for art to be effective, it must be like fashion. It can't, you know, sort of pretend to be autonomous from other cultural forms. And for him, art will change life much more if it's fully immersed in those kinds of tendencies and trends, you know, as you said about consumerism, which is very, very interesting. But I'm also thinking, like, historically, Ben, you were saying before, but like as you said, Alison, I mean, specific examples of designers, but I even think of that famous image of the model, the Cecil Beaton photo of the model standing in front of a Jackson Pollock Autumn Mist or something from 1950, a way in which those two things have worked together. Are there examples of designers and artists that you particularly like or come to mind?
Just getting back to the Murakami and the Louis Vuitton thing, I think that there's also a certain thing about it's really good for business too. At the Murakami retrospective show in New York a number of years ago, there was actually a Vuitton boutique in the middle of the exhibition, and you know, that caused quite a bit of controversy.
And how grey that area has become now. That just seems, I mean, I admit I love museum and gallery shops. I love them. I love to go to Matisse and then buy the postcard. I don't know what that's about, because I mean, I have loads of art books, but I still want that little postcard. And I think it taps into that thing of what it is, desire, isn't it? Like, about how coveting on some level something.
And it gets back, I suppose, to Suzi's point about the democratisation, really, of fashion. That, as you say, I mean, the postcard is an object that everyone can afford and therefore have their share of culture in that way.
But you know that thing about democratisation, I totally agree, because I think that's really valid, and I think that something with like Alexander McQueen and the success of that exhibition, and you know, you talk to people, or Andrew Bolton will say that it is about how people have an understanding of clothing, so that's their connection to an exhibition like that. And yet I still do find it really fascinating, because it's so far removed from most people's concept of what clothing might be, and it's arguably like the installation of clothing, and it's very avant-garde. It's very much out there, and that kind of fashion, on one level, is incredibly elitist. It's very elitist, and it's so surprising to me, pleasantly surprising, that so many people would go to that exhibition and just love it. You know, go in their thousands to see that exhibition, and yet, in this institution, you might put on something quite avant-garde, and people are quite quick to critique and criticise. It's a really tricky thing.
Do you think I hadn't considered this until you said that, so I'm going to be provocative, but don't throw any things at me. I just wonder whether part of it, and I've got my parents' voices in my head, who are a certain age, they live in Wales, they don't understand contemporary art at all. To them, anybody could do it, there's no technique to it. You know, why would you... Yeah, there you go, they're nodding. and it's interesting that this interest in really high technique fashion, and you see people in those exhibitions, there is this incredible just incredible appreciation for the craft.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's actually an
Absolutely.
interesting thing to me that fashion is now taking that place where people walk around those things and go, look at that. I can't imagine
Making
how that was made, versus what on earth is that? My 4-year-old could do
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So it's actually, there's a kind of an interesting thing there for me where fashion has somehow taken that
Yes.
place, which is, it is still about technique in those sorts of exhibitions. And I think that's found a place with audiences that perhaps contemporary art has moved away from.
I actually think you have hit the nail on the head there, because I do think, for me, certainly looking at Valentino, I was so astounded that it had been made by hand. Like, I really found that really wonderful. And there is something, but I think also in contemporary, I don't know what you think, Mark, but I think there is a return to this haptic and handmade thing. I think people are quite drawn to that, and to that which is handmade. I think there is something in that, which means you'll never really, you still don't lose the obsession with Jeff Koons, for example, and his team of people who create things, and there's something in that as well. But it is, I think you're right, there is this handmade quality that's astonishing. And
but I think you're right. I think in a way, with art, as I agree, there certainly has been a recent tendency to return back to craft. But I think, back to your point, Suzi, I think the way art's been driven continually by conceptual ideas, and I think you might argue that they've been running, some parts of the art scene have been running away from the democratic by becoming more and more conceptual. But I think in some ways that the idea of participatory art has replaced that. So rather than craft and demonstration of the craft, with fashion does, as you said so brilliantly, I think a lot of recent art try to engage people and make them participate in the making of the artwork to fulfil the same kind of task. But in doing so, they haven't had that craft and the admiration. Yes, people have been involved and feel a part of it, but it's still missing that idea of looking at what's made and going, oh, that is just brilliant, I could not possibly do that myself. That's my
And I don't think maybe a lot of people don't appreciate the extraordinary amount of craftsmanship that does go into what looks like a perfectly simple dress. I think there was a nice example. One of the students at QCA was working on the install of Valentino, and he wasn't the slightest bit interested in fashion, but he came up to me, he said, I was amazed. He said, I was just amazed. He said, you look at these dresses, you know, when you've got to take them apart and put them together. He said, there's hours and hours and hours of craftsmanship that goes into these things. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realise until you get up close and personal with the work itself, which you can do pretty much in a museum.
Yeah, that's where the quality comes from.
Yeah.
And also I think, I agree with you, Ben, but I mean, that's too where, I mean, as you said, it's about craft and work, but it's about what is then aesthetically produced, isn't it? It's what the quality is part of the aesthetic appreciation which art has shared in the past.
And I think that's all part of a movement back to the idea of the handmade, which everything in our culture today is so throwaway. Nothing's made to last anymore. I think that's going back. I know in Japan at the moment there's a big movement amongst young people setting up tiny weeny little shops and little ateliers, going back into making leather goods or making wooden boxes or brushes or lacquer. It's a way of really rediscovering something that's lasting.
Is anything similar happening in Australia, whether that's work with designers and artists, or as you say, Ben, that kind of, that's almost like, well, it's kind of high-end cottage industry stuff, isn't it? You know,
I think a great example at the moment of what's happening in Australia is with Romances Born. You'll see some of the slides up there. And they've collaborated with two different artists. In 2008, they collaborated with Del Catherine Barton, who did some phenomenal fabric designs for them. And then in 2010, they collaborated with Kate Rode, who makes these extraordinary, like old-time museum installations. I think, now you would know this, I think she once described her work as like the old museum on acid or something.
yeah, well, there's sort of all neon colours and synthetic creatures.
Yes.
And they've just done one with Nell as well.
Ah, okay.
Collaborated with her, and they're pretty fantastic as well.
Yeah.
so to create fabrics with which they then use to, you know, make their garments, I guess. And closer to home, Easton Pearson with Stephen Mock. And I think there's, I mean, you see quite a lot, I guess, in that regard. But I think the ones that, maybe not in Australia to digress, but you were asking earlier about ones that were interesting or things that you thought were of relevance. There's a slide that comes up of Cindy Sherman for Balenciaga, which I think is to be one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. And so clever, because it's so Cindy Sherman to, you know, be a photographer and take on these guises and costumes and be something completely other. But to do it for Balenciaga is such a risk, in a way, for Balenciaga to take. Because in a way, those ads are kind of ugly. They're not speaking to beauty on any level, which is, again, the other cliche of fashion, perhaps, that I think is interesting. And this is me, just a thought, is that art is not afraid to be ugly, whereas fashion is not entirely sure it's happy about being ugly. Yeah. So you don't see it so much in fashion, particularly in that public face of fashion. You don't see ugliness so much. I think McQueen toyed with it a lot, you know, with the fashion, the catwalk. He wasn't afraid to make people look, you know, they'd been attacked or whatever. But that Balenciaga and Cindy Sherman is just so clever because, you know, she's acting this role of the socialite wearing Balenciaga. And I would say that it's a very small portion of people who buy Balenciaga who even know who Cindy Sherman is, but she is possibly the most significant female contemporary artist. Certainly that I can think of in terms of that medium.
And also, sorry, I'll try and keep an eye out for
yeah,
it
for
when
the
it comes unfreeze it. But yes, the other thing, of course, that Shem does is she's, in a way, she satirises the people who collect her art.
Exactly, who wear Balenciaga.
Yes. And
it's wonderful. It's very, very, very clever. And of course, they took ads in fashion journals at the same time that they took ads in Vogue, which is wonderful. And that's something that you see more now as well. We're talking about that. It's not uncommon to see, a Gucci ad or Louis Vuitton inside Flash Art or Art Review. And you would remember there's a time when you never saw that, really, even though there has been a very long and prestigious relationship between art and fashion. It's just that is a more recent occurrence to see those ads. And partly because all of those fashion houses, well, not all of them, but Prada has a very important art foundation now. They do some of the most significant art exhibitions in the world. And Louis Vuitton too, their collection is amazing. But what Miuccia Prada does with her collection and the way she supports artists, she's like very much a traditional patron in that regard. She's really putting her money where her mouth is.
Yeah, that's become increasingly. Cartier's had a foundation for a long time as well, and the works, the exhibitions they put on are quite phenomenal. I mean, I think just getting back to business again, a lot of the fashion houses have the money to do it, whereas a lot of the galleries these days unfortunately don't have as much.
And wouldn't it be great? I've always thought it'd be great to see that in Australia, that a fashion house maybe, or something similar, might have a foundation in quite that public way. Because you can visit Prada in Venice and in Milan, and you can visit Cartier, and you can visit Trussardi as well. Trussardi is more a moving one, but Trussardi is actually one of the oldest ones in the world, and it's fantastic. The projects that they have done with artists are really incredible, and major contemporary artists before people really even knew they were, like Darren Almond and people like that. I think that's really fascinating and quite risky, actually, because it could backfire quite badly if an artist does something, I don't know, provocative that people don't like. Does it stop someone buying their product?
So no, and but I just wanted to know, perhaps if we could discuss Kusama a little. What are people's opinions of the fashion work she started to do in the late 1960s, apart from looking like something could have fitted right into Blow Up by Antonioni? What's your view of Kusama's entry into clothing design?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising when you look at her work, and especially when you look at what she's gone on to do throughout her life, that she moved between fashion and art, and I think particularly the time. I mean, it was just it's almost impossible to imagine her not having done that. I don't think it's certainly something I didn't realise that she had been that involved in. So it's quite interesting to look back at some of these images. But I think the way she continues to change herself and think of herself as a work of art. I think it makes it very natural that she would have been involved in fashion.
well, she is her art rather than just what she makes, isn't
Yeah.
it? I think.
Yeah.
She
Yeah,
lives
it's,
it.
as you said, Susie, I mean, the 60s, of course, is a period in which, demonstrated, I suppose, what we talked about right at the start, this idea that art and fashion, whatever, need not just exist in their own discrete areas as areas of culture, that they could be brought together, and an artist could work on fashion, fashion could work on, fashion design could work on art, etc.
I think the other thing, and we were talking before about the Louis Vuitton, the thing that happened in the 60s, which we tend to forget now because youth is so all important, is an incredible shift from, grown-ups being all powerful to youth being not only fashionable but having money to consume, being incredibly influential. And I wonder if, especially with those grown-up brands, those luxury brands who tended that their market had grown up and older with them, and whether that's Chanel or Louis Vuitton, this sort of reclaiming of a new youth market is something that's happening again now that happened probably really powerfully for the last time in the 60s.
And that's linked to more of an open mind. Oh, what have I done? More open-minded. Just sort of youth is more open-minded. They're more willing to take chances and stuff like that. Yeah.
It's also, if you get back to business again, it's a way of broadening your market base too.
And then I think there's also that inescapable design quotient. Someone like Murakami is just a great designer, and so is Kusama. Look at those dots; they're incredible. If you've been into the obliteration room, it's just fantastic. It's quite clear that whatever product they make will just be fantastic because people will respond to that on some level. So I think there is a recognition that maybe there's a freshening of a brand, and again, that comes back to that 24-hour news cycle and just the immediacy and wanting more and more and more and more. And how do you actually top that, I guess? Or how do you keep it fresh? And it is really wonderful that someone, I guess, of her age is reaching this entire youth market is wonderful. It would be lovely to think that there'd be a lot of people going into Louis Vuitton just getting totally into Yayoi Kusama, but you have to wonder if it translates like that past these spotty things.
Well, that's what I was about to ask you. Does Marc Jacobs just like the dots?
Yeah.
Or is it about, as you've been saying as well, it's about an attitude towards creativity?
I think you've probably all seen that. There's a really wonderful documentary with Marc Jacobs where he meets her for the first time, and he sort of is asked the question, is fashion art? And he's like, definitely not. It's definitely not. And then he meets her, and he's so deferential. He's just absolutely, in awe of this woman. And it's a really beautiful moment, actually, where he is kind of like, what you do is phenomenal. And I think it is bigger for him. I definitely think it's bigger for him than just, aesthetics. But I don't think he's naive either. No, he's thinking about the broader brand and how that works. Because not all collaborations are successful, of course. They don't all work. And some things work and some things just don't work. Imagine Andy Warhol would have lost his mind if he could have collaborated with LV. It would have been his absolute moment. I almost feel sorry for him because he was just so far ahead. In a way, he'd kind of done it all. He did all of that, all that kind of very clever analysis of art and the market and contemporary culture. He just had it there before it was actually. Imagine what he would have done with Twitter and Facebook. My God, just be incredible.
I guess it's probably if you look at a lot of the designers who have collaborated with artists, there's always that. I think a lot of it comes back to the very graphic nature of the artist's work that they gravitate to. Murakami and Kusama, both their work is incredibly graphic. If you look at what Saint Laurent's done with Mondrian, once again, it's very graphic. The Warhol stuff, the pop art that he looked at, it's an easy collaboration too, I guess. It's an easy way to bring it into, the design realm.
And then what about questions like the other things they may share, which are not necessarily discipline, for want of a better word, discipline specific, but I'm thinking things like celebrity, the notions of fashion celebrity and art celebrity and how dominant that is. And also branding. I was going to ask whether clearly fashion is, in some ways, embraces branding to some degree, depending on what you want to be associated with. But I think maybe one could argue that art itself has become more about branding itself in recent times. Is that? Can you do anything with that? Is that something you've seen or?
I think if you look at the collaborations and things that have happened, the artists that have been involved are already very well established. They're already very big names. They're already brands, if you will.
Yes,
so I think bringing that on board, you know, you're linking yourself to another big brand.
And yet there are smaller ones too, you know, Erwin Wurm for Hermes, which is so kind of out there and odd. It's like an odd collaboration, but it worked, you know. It's taking this really reverential old house and quite a contemporary artist and doing something there. And again, it's an odd thing, you know, it doesn't always work. Olaf Breuning with Bali is kind of interesting as well. And yes, he's a brand, but I don't know how well it works in a weird way. And that's kind of nice, a bit of that tension. But certainly I agree with you, because I think art is very much a branded thing. And if you look at the big art fairs now, like Art Hong Kong, Art Basel, Art Miami, that is a brand that travels worldwide, and it's grown. And certainly this notion of celebrity, because when I was at the last Venice Biennale, Brad Pitt was in town, and the talk of Art Basel was about what Brad Pitt bought and his entourage. And isn't that funny? Because everyone was kind of fawning. It was about Brad Pitt and the fact that iPads had just arrived on the scene. So every dealer worth their salt had an iPad. So it was really about that. And not about, because it was just in that GFC moment where no one was really buying any art at all. So it was about all this other stuff that comes around it. But art certainly has that cult of celebrity around it, I think.
Yes, in fact, I read recently a Guardian article of Saatchi, the advertising guru, who was actually complaining that people just buy, you know, the rich people buying art as a brand without really considering other aspects of that. And also at that Venice Biennale there was that massive boat, wasn't there? And I think George Clooney was there and all that. So it's become like the Venice
the Russians are
Film
coming.
Festival and every other kind of Cannes Film Festival. Venice Biennale art is very much firmly entrenched in that kind of celebrity circuit, you might all say.
And yet, I mean, it always has been. If you think someone like Basquiat, who's such a great artist and sadly now dead, but I love that kind of idea of someone being really grungy and on the street and then becomes the coolest thing, and he's taken on by wealthy people and then he's collected and then all these things. I mean, Warhol was the same, and Richard Prince too. I mean, Richard Prince has this wonderful comment when Louis Vuitton asked him to collaborate, and he said to someone, "I'm going to be rich finally." And I mean, the thing is, the guy had actually already made tons of money, and he makes so much money. But how funny is that? That kind of, and very wonderful kind of ironic recognition that he'll suddenly be at the big time.
And then a more recent example of that street art, Banksy, the English artist who started with graffiti, and you know, I saw a show in New York a couple of years ago where he was transferring all of those things onto T-shirts and selling them as art fashion products in the gallery, which is, he turned the gallery basically into a shop. In that sense, you know, galleries are shops, but it was more self-consciously a retail. It was more self-consciously a retail outlet for his T-shirts. So again, another example, isn't it, of that those. There's not really those distinctions anymore.
Well, and I think, Suzi, and you might want to talk to this, but we were talking about that idea of galleries being places of entertainment, and I mean, they are, and I think this institution is an example of that, and that's in no way to denigrate it, because I think that's a fantastic thing. I think there is certainly a time when I was studying art history, you know, you'd come and there's not many people on a Saturday wandering around. Well, I think we all know how many people are here today, and at the other institution, and it has changed. There has been a shift. It's like a new form of entertainment now. I mean, you might like to talk about that, Suzi, because you were talking about that before.
Well, I think it's very true, and it's interesting. I was thinking before about what that people's comfort or discomfort or understanding around fashion or art, and just going through this exhibition earlier, and people were having to be told to stop touching things, and that was really, you know, it was kind of they're just asking you to touch them, and then, you know, this is for looking at, not touching, and I think that does that people struggle with that now. They don't expect to not be able to touch things or take them home,
That's
buy
right.
a bit of it. You know, so it's an interesting one that galleries have moved into. Just going back to what we were talking about before, I think maybe one of the other things about that brand idea is that it's so easy now to find out more about an artist or a designer. I mean, you know, you can see one thing, and increasingly you can put that into your phone and it'll tell you all of, you know, it'll recognise it and it'll tell you everything else and where you can find more about that artist. And I think in a way that makes it more like a brand. You know, you see one piece, you can understand the history of them. And I think that's changed, you know, because you can engage with them in lots of different places and get a sense of what that brand is about. Where before, probably, unless you went to the right place, you weren't going to need to engage with art at all. It's very easy not to see it, not to engage with it. Where, of course, fashion was always much harder to not engage with in that sense.
Yeah, and I think just you saying that makes me think of a very art term, and that is iconic. That things like that, and I think digital media is to be, you know, is the reason. As you say, those sorts of things become iconic much more quickly because it has a broader distribution. A lot more people see it, and it becomes recognisable much faster. You know, and to a obviously much broader population. I think that's the key, isn't it? It's that exposure to much broader markets all the time. And those markets, of course, are very complex, aren't they? The cultures are very complex. And the way in which they consume culture is complex.
Yes.
Becomes like the it bag or the it shoe of the season. Everybody, you know, is wondering where the next one is going to come from, who's going to do it. And I think Vuitton's bags and his collaborations have been the it bags for quite a long while now.
And again, with those prices would have become a little less expensive. With Vuitton, it's still expensive, aren't they, Vuitton bags? But they would not have been so out of range as in the past. Is that accurate or not?
They're well out of my range.
So, but even still.
No, but I think you make a good point, because I think, yes, they are, you know, incredibly expensive, but one can buy, you know, a key card, something to hold your keys in or whatever. So there's like all level of product is catered for. So iPad covers or iPhone covers, it's all there, you know. So you can have your little bit of a thing.
I mean, I suppose the other thing there is that the beauty of fashion is that it's public as well as private. You can take it out and show people.
That's
you
a good
don't
one.
take your art out, do you? You know, you might have it at home and you might know you've got it, but you can't just go, oh yes.
And if you bought it with your super, you're not even allowed to hang it in your house.
Right. So exactly. You probably can't even hang it.
No,
in
you
your
can't
house.
even
So
hang in your house if you
there
bought
is
it.
that of being able to take it out with you and show people how.
And certainly
colours
someone like
Status symbol, yeah.
like Daphne Guinness, of course, you know, wears it. I
That's
guess.
yes.
And that's, as Ben said, you know, the status symbol, I mean, that's so powerful, isn't it? And fashion is so well placed for that because of its mobility. You know, you can walk out with your latest clothes and walk along the street and announce it to everybody, that kind of idea of status. And fashion has, you know, it's got a lot of symbolic and iconic power, but it has that fabulous mobility too.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talked about how transient it is, but, I mean, fashion hundreds of years ago was something that would have been a dowry. You would have passed it on. That fabric would have had a life well beyond 1 year or generation. And I think the other thing about that brings them together, you know, if you showed an image of 1960s, 1970s, 1980s fashion, maybe not 1990s, it wasn't a great day, but most people would instantly recognise them. So there are, although it's transient, it's also a real marker, and maybe art and fashion both do that as well. Most people, there's a real marker there of time in ways that many other things don't do.
Yeah, although it's harder now, don't you think? I think with art, I don't know if you could do that anymore.
Was that
could
last
you do that
week
with
or the
art?
week before?
I think with fashion it's harder to tell what era.
Yeah.
And then maybe with art too, it's increasingly difficult. But I think you're right, absolutely. You can look historically and know exactly when something is from.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering if I would open it up to some questions. Hopefully we've raised some interesting issues that have got you thinking, and you'd like to discuss any of your thoughts a bit more with any of the panel members. Are there any questions or any
First one's
points of
always the
discussion? Oh, good, thanks.
I wanted to ask, is this on?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I wanted to ask whether you think there's a real sense of cultural amnesia about the relationship between art and fashion. I mean, something you were talking about was, say, stores and museums, which has been around since the start of stores and museums. They've always been very, very closely aligned. You know, in the 1920s, museums had design shows in which products were marked by their price, and people could go to the manufacturer and buy them. MoMA did that. The Metropolitan Museum of Art did that. I wonder if you can account for that sense of cultural amnesia and why we're always having to have this discussion about the relationship between art and fashion as though it's a new thing.
I think for me, I would say, so I'll jump in first, I think art has always been very good at playing the double game. And even when you think about, you know, the kind of idea that the avant-garde was beyond commerce, that, you know, filthy lucre, it has nothing to do with us, you know, we make useless things, but, you know, all along, artists having patrons or selling their work on the market. And I think, you know, it's a really good point, is that you know, it's always played the double game in that way, and I think it's always played the double game when it's come to fashion. And I think, too, like, as you say, we're talking about it now, I think at moments like that, it gets pinned. You know, like we're able to pin, and of course it'll elude it and run off again. But at times, I think it does get pinned. It's a good point. It's an ongoing relationship, isn't it? It's always there. But there's that double game where sometimes art pretends it's not there. You know,
I think a lot of shops, particularly department stores, have also used it to maybe give themselves a level of prestige by having an art gallery in the department store. It's not as popular now, I don't think, but David Jones in Sydney always had an art gallery, and they always had really quite exceptional shows that were on there. It's still an incredibly popular thing in Japan. I recently, in a department store in Kyoto, saw an amazing collection of Bruegel's prints from the National Library of Belgium. It's like, a department store is able to get a show like this. It's pretty amazing.
it is. I think Myer in Melbourne also had the 6th floor. They used to have an art gallery at the top.
Yeah.
That's very true. Yeah. We've just got the Sherman too to warm everybody up and keep it going.
Such a good idea.
Reminds me.
You mentioned photography before as a trend in fashion and art. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the current sort of crop of fashionable photographers, I guess, like Terry Richardson and David LaChapelle.
Well, I think you make a really good point there, because I think that is something that doesn't get talked about so much about fashion and art, but that's certainly something that's a huge area. Jürgen Teller, for example, these are photographers and artists who have worked with fashion houses for a very long time, at the same time that they've had maybe their own fine art practice going along, and there's so many contemporary photographers working with fashion designers. I think it's a really interesting area, because sometimes they're the ones doing the edgiest thing that's out there, and you can't always tell. You know, when you look at in a fashion magazine, it might be editorial, but you're not really sure. It reads like an art magazine, you know, and I personally really like that. I think that's an interesting thing to come across. And further on that, you see a lot of fashion houses now working with filmmakers to create one-off films for their product as well, working with high-end film directors, and that's all very new. That particularly, those films and things, is quite interesting, the way that goes out there. It's in a way underexplored, although I think Jürgen Teller is having a retrospective right now in Germany.
He's the person that came to mind, and it is a really interesting point, because then it got me thinking about, well, there's fashion and there's art, but then there's mediation, the mediation of fashion. It's almost like a paraphernalia of fashion, though that term might seem a bit too transient, but and it's the iconicity of fashion, and it has a particular aesthetic qualities and all of that, and as you say, people like Teller have just borrowed from it, hasn't he, and incorporated it into fine arts practice,
Yeah.
and vice versa, of
Yeah.
course. You know, fashion photographers are always borrowing from art as well, I imagine. Yeah.
And interestingly, I think on that note is probably photographers have never had a dilemma with selling those photographs as fine art. So something that Jürgen Teller might do would sell very happily in a contemporary art gallery and maybe not be open to criticism or that kind of art critique, if you know what I mean. Because I think there's always this debate about whether fashion has criticality around it or not, you know, and certainly contemporary art does. You know, it's kind of a scary world to be a contemporary artist. And I'm not saying that it isn't for a fashion designer, but it's a different kind of criticality.
But then, but I suppose what they share is both fields have been intensely competitive.
Yes.
And the pressure on the fashion designer is to mark out, well, I imagine one of the many pressures would be to mark out a singular style and have that style be accepted and then develop it. I mean, there's so many designers working, aren't there, to get that cut through. That would be extremely stressful at times, I imagine.
And so few that succeed. I mean, what we've talked about today are really major brands, whether
Yes.
they're artists or fashion designers. You know, they're in both areas. I think the interesting thing at the beginning when talking about fashion as being all about big money and art, perhaps not. But in truth, for a beginning artist or fashion designer, and a part of the problem with the survival rate or the very low survival rate is that money is almost an added thing. It's based on passion, it's you know, it's something they have to do, and an income is a surplus. You know, and there's an interesting thing how few actually really do go on to be successful in either sphere.
Right, when Lacroix went bankrupt, it came out that I don't think there was a single collection that had ever made a profit.
Oh, and Galliano went bankrupt a multitude of times before he was taken over by Dior. I mean, his own label hardly ever made money.
Which is actually sort of beautiful. I mean, that's the great artistic folly in a way, this idea of... But if you think about it, like so many artists just found fame posthumously, literally, you know, and how sad that is on one level. But we are living in a different time, I think, where people like Takashi Murakami are just mega millionaires. You know, that's just, it's bizarre, really. And there is a small echelon of contemporary artists who are incredibly, you know, they're millionaires, basically. And that is different.
Yeah, they become a kind of aristocracy, don't they, with
Yeah,
their,
yeah.
when they travel to Paris, they have their
Absolutely.
hangers-on that go with them and
Yeah.
everything. Yes, that's right,
It's
it's very interesting.
huge.
But also the point about creativity reminds you too of what Nadia said, that that's ways in which art and fashion designers, they really share that passion. You know, they're exactly the same sensibilities. It says not driven by money, by achieving money, even though that's become much more advertised, I think, the idea of making a lot of money. But yeah, that idea that it's both about chasing the creative excellence in some ways. Yeah.
And exploring themes throughout a lifetime often. You know, coming back
Yes.
repeatedly to a piece of work. You know, I was thinking about the Matisse exhibition as well. You know, those decades of drawings that he just returned to and returned to and returned to. And, you know, I think that the best fashion designers are the same, you know, at least twice a year now, increasingly 4 or 6 times a year, but returning to an idea and taking it further. And that pressure and that creative drive is an interesting thing, particularly when they have got lots of money, because there's no drive to have to do it.
Yeah, and then it makes you think of Kusama, what you've just said, that in a way Kusama has been, in her own way, she's been working through exactly that kind of idea, and now, you know, Jacobs and Vuitton and that, she's now you know, that's being now, I suppose, incorporated into that fashion area, or used.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Only 2 so far. A couple more at least. Oh, good. Please do.
It's fine. I just wanted to ask you to think about as well the body as something that does differentiate fashion, and maybe think about perhaps that's the reason why fashion is often seen as lesser to art, because it has this sort of very lowly constraint. You know, the body's often seen as kind of an abject thing.
Yeah, and I think that's linked, I suppose, to the high art denigration of fashion to the sense that it's functional. You know, it's, but I think, you know, that's, Nadia, I just think about that. I mean, you know, yes, because it's to do with the body, it has a certain function, therefore it's lower down on the scale of culture than art. But I think with the increasing pressures, certainly of a neoliberal ideology and consumer culture, I think art is increasingly, has been under a lot of pressure in the last couple of decades to be functional. And if that functional is participatory art or whatever, getting the kids to make Lego blocks or whatever that might be. And I think that's another, you know, like, it'd be interesting to see where that goes, because art itself is functional, so it can't continue to maintain the fiction of its superiority in some ways. And I think in some ways, even though there's still prestige product, and as Alison said, there's multimillionaires that are doing it, I think in some ways there has been quite a sustained attack on cultural elitism. I still can't understand why it's not been associated with attacks on political elitism and economic elitism. However, I'll let that go. But you know, the idea that of cultural elitism, I think, has had an effect of making art more functional. So, and maybe that may be part explaining why there has been a lot of sort of much more collaboration between art and fashion, even though, as everyone has indicated, that's been going on for some time, but maybe it's a lot more now because of that. They're just becoming closer.
It's like the difference between digital and analogue, I guess, on some level. But I know, you know, when Easton Pearson we have their very beautiful exhibition here, I was at that media call, and they were asked the question, you know, is it not a conflict of interest to have your product here and then available for purchase in the shop? And they were rightly, you know, affronted by that, because it's such a dumb argument. I mean, anyone can walk out of a gallery and go and buy Balenciaga's, you know, Cindy Sherman photograph should they wish to. So there's no kind of barrier to that at all. So I think there is still this perception that fashion has a commercial imperative, whereas art does not. And yet we know that that's, you know, not true. That art does have a commercial imperative in the main, I would argue, today. I think that it would be naive to say otherwise. I think most contemporary art is coming from that place.
That's true, and obviously from the side of fashion, yes, there is the bodily, there is that sort of idea of function, but there, as has been raised again, there's a lot of cultural creativity that goes beyond that, those kinds of functional aspects. Well, I think maybe on that point, I think our hour has ticked by. So thank you so much for turning up, and I hope you got something out of it of value. So thank you again for turning up, and thank you for my guests.
Thank you, Mark.